strategic dialogue is required to avoid miscalculation and misunderstanding. And unfortunately, we've got ourselves in this position. It's very difficult to now unpick it because of our own, I think, daft decision 2 years ago.
Defence chiefs in the UK are under pressure to reboot channels with Moscow. The top brass of the British and Russian military have not spoken in 4 years, and diplomats fear that a misunderstanding in the high seas could trigger a wider conflict. There have, of course, been recent incidents in the Channel, as well as the Norwegian Sea and elsewhere. Joining me to talk about this is John Foreman, a former defence attaché in Moscow and Kyiv. Welcome to the show, John.
Hello, Ed.
Well, this seems kind of eminently sensible. There is a risk, given the amount of Russian naval activity in the English Channel, for example. How would one go about re-establishing connections?
Well, I think the problem we've got, before I get to that question, is that we broke off mill-to-mill relations first in 2018, cooperation after the poisoning of Salisbury, and then we sort of terminated it 2 years ago when we expelled the Russian defence attaché, and the Russians did the same thing. So we don't have any mill-to-mill relations the first time since 1941, which I think is a bad idea, because the Russian armed forces are the biggest in Europe. They're nuclear armed. They're in a war in Ukraine. As you say, they're doing antagonistic stuff in and around the UK. I think the way of redoing this is to take it off camera, move away from John Heaney's sort of rather stale calling out Mr. Putin for headlines, and approaching the Russians seriously with a proposal. And I think that can be done. That's how we got Admiral Radikin as Chief of Defence Staff to speak to General Gerasimov before the war in Ukraine.
What about other countries? I mean, would the US have relationships between the US military and the Russian military at the moment?
They have. I know that the commander of EUCOM, Euro Forces Command, US European Command Europe, who's also Supreme Allied Command Europe, has had a direct dialogue. And also the Americans have been sending various emissaries to Moscow as part of the peace process and bilateral relations between the US and Russia. But I think as Britain, we shouldn't delegate our relations to the United States. NATO broke its own relations with Russia, mill-to-mill relations in 2021. So it's a really sort of barren field at the moment. And I think as a sensible, responsible military power in Europe, we should be leading the way.
It's interesting you refer to mill-to-mill relationships. That's the relationships between the top of each country's military. But what about standard diplomatic relations? I mean, we still have an ambassador in Moscow. They have one in London. Is that one way that we can communicate in any event?
Well, I think I looked at the statement from the government in the article you mentioned in the Times, and a government spokesman said, we use the embassy for delivering messages. Well, I think, you were the Minister for Communications. Communications dialogue is not about delivering just robust messages. It's actually about talking to each other. So I think the ambassador, whilst we don't have a defence attaché and while we don't have direct talks with the Russian military, the ambassador has to hold the fort. But the reason we have had specialist military advisors in embassies since the Crimean War, it was because it was recognised that British diplomats don't have the expertise to really talk Turkey on technical matters.
Yes, so talking Turkey on technical matters is one of the important things here. And the way you kind of describe it, John, it almost seems like we're not talking to the Russian military as a sort of way of punishing the Russians, which is perhaps understandable. And you talked about the initial break-off of relationships after the Salisbury poisonings. But punishing the Russians is one thing, but in a sense, hampering your efforts to establish an understanding and avoid a catastrophe is quite another. So is this a case, as it were, of the British cutting off their nose to spite their face?
I think the previous government took the decision too lightly to expel the Russian defence attaché, to appear tough to the Russians, about other Russians. And then the Labour opposition, as it was at the time, rode in behind to show they were equally tough on the Russians. But I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can continue to be a leading member of NATO, continue to modernise our nuclear deterrent, continue to support Ukraine. But at the same time, we can talk to the Russians. Our history tells us we had mill-to-mill military contacts with Nazi Germany up till 1939, with Imperial Germany up until 1914, and all throughout the Cold War during some particularly difficult times, because it was recognised strategically that strategic dialogue is required to avoid miscalculation and misunderstanding. And unfortunately, we've got ourselves in this position. It's very difficult to now unpick it because of our own, I think, daft decision 2 years ago.
You say it's a daft decision, so you're not sitting on the fence on that one. I'm interested in your experience as a defence attaché and your relationship with the Russian military. And you made the point about sort of technical understanding. So I think what you're saying is that there is a qualitative difference when two military people, as it were, have a conversation, because you're both able to understand much better perhaps than two diplomats what each military is up to. What are those conversations like? What was your relationship like with the Russian military? And is there a sort of dance, because you don't necessarily want to give away any military secrets while you're discussing the operations of each country in order to avoid a misunderstanding?
Well, I mean, it was very difficult, to be honest. Life and working in Moscow was extremely difficult before the war, and it got more difficult after Putin's invasion in 2022. And I took the position of being professional as far as I could be and objective to make sure what we were trying to say to the Russians got across, and also to hear what they were saying to us. For example, I was summoned 2 or 3 times to be shouted at by the Russians about British naval manoeuvres and exercises in and around Russia and the transit of HMS Defender through Crimean waters. I think the point is not to rise to the occasion. I mean, but also, notwithstanding that, after the war, lead up to the war and after the war, we could talk about matters of strategic stability between the two countries and not frame everything through the war, for example, about nuclear postures or a return of British people who've been serving in the Ukrainian armed forces and held as prisoners of war. So these are good things, or good ways of actually getting good channels of getting that sort of information across. And of course, if you have a Russian expert in London, he can be taken into the Ministry of Defence and the British position spelled out quite clearly to him, and vice versa.
The interesting thing about the Russian approach for me is it works on 2 levels. There's sort of posturing, where you conduct a live fire exercise in the English Channel or something, and then there's actually a very real threat to our security through attacks on our infrastructure. How do you kind of differentiate between those? Can you get I've often wondered, can we not get a message to the Russians? Can we not have a defence doctrine which says, if you're going to kind of start surveying our cables and put in place measures to potentially sabotage them, that's something we won't put up with? And how do you avoid escalation from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to differentiate between bluster and serious issues. So I wasn't particularly concerned about a small-scale gunnery exercise in the English Channel. And the good news was the Russians actually stuck to the treaty I negotiated with them about the conduct of vessels in proximity of one another. So that's a good thing. But I think serious matters such as surveilling undersea cables threatening to board British vessels, for example, in response to British boarding the Shadow Fleet, does require more serious and sensible discussions between the Chief of Defence Staff and General Gerasimov, and to do it off camera and not to shout at each other through the front pages of the Times or the Sun. So I think you can get those things across. We can spell out, as we did before Ukraine, what our response would be if Russia invaded, and then we followed through on that. We told them they get more NATO, which we would support. We told them about nuclear guarantees to the new countries. We told them about what would happen in terms of posture and relations. So I think we shouldn't be sort of fired up every time Russia does something. I think we should separate the wheat from the chaff.
And the Russians, to a certain extent, think we're bluffers. I mean, do you take seriously these reports that the Russians might do an incursion into a NATO territory to test our resolve?
No, I don't. Not at all. No, I think I wrote for The Spectator, and I've said publicly since that I don't think Russia wants to attack NATO directly because of the risk of, again, unintended consequence and escalation, to including nuclear escalation. I think what Russia is doing now, attacking us by cyber, interfering with cables, plotting assassinations, doing arson against political figures such as the Prime Minister, using ne'er-do-wells on the internet to carry out sabotage attacks, is what is the most likely threat, and that's what they're already doing. And I think that's much more a police and security task than a defence task. I think the military should be focused on defence and deterrence to the Euro-Atlantic area. And I think, actually, if you look at the NATO summit, we're actually hanging together fairly well, notwithstanding the ructions occasionally from over the Atlantic.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That's John Foreman, a former defence attaché in Moscow and Kyiv, talking about the need for the British to re-establish mill-to-mill or military-to-military relationships in order to avoid a misunderstanding and possible escalation as a result of military activity.